Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. And on behalf of the Wisdom School of Ubiquity University, I want to welcome you to this first lecture in 2021 of our Great Books course. It's a course that Georgie Szabo and I have developed. One of my favorite courses to participate in by month. To just make a comment on what makes a great book great. There have been probably millions of books written, a handful, maybe only a couple hundred that are considered to be great. Just like in all the annals of the kings and queens and monarchs that have governed cities and states and empires, there's only maybe a couple dozen that have earned the title, the Great, like Alexander the Great, Catherine the Great. Let's begin by considering what makes a book great, and then we'll launch into a truly great work coming out of the 20th century, George Orwell's 1984. There are three things, I think, that constitute a great work. One is that it's a book that endures over time, and it endures across cultures. There's something universal about a great book. There's something that speaks to everybody, everywhere. And that is a very important consideration, the notion of greatness and universality. Secondly, a great book is universal because it addresses noble themes. It's not a gossip column. It doesn't deal with superficialities. It deals with issues that challenge humanity itself. Just think of the opening lines of the Iliad. Speak, O Muse, of the wrath of Achilles. The wrath of a warrior in battle is something that everyone everywhere understands. Think of the opening of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. What could be more profound than that? So a great book is universal because it speaks to the perennial wisdom, those issues and those challenges that actually characterize the architecture of what it means to be human. Those are addressed in a great work. And then thirdly, a great book transforms lives. Human beings are intelligent. Books are intelligent. You pick up a great book, and you're picking up an intelligence not your own, that when you read it, it comes inside your psyche and soul like an irritant, a grain of sand in an oyster, and begins to agitate. And if you honor it, it produces a great pearl of great price. Just think of how many millions of people have been moved by the Quran, by the Bible, by the Bhagavad Gita, by the Tao Te Ching. Battles have been fought over the interpretation of words in books. People have been burnt to the stake for writing certain books. You've all heard the stories of people going into hotels or motels across America and into Europe, and they're despondent, suicidal, depressed, angry. They sit on their bed. They aimlessly open the drawer to the cabinet, and what do they see inside but a Bible? They pick up the Bible, they open it, and a verse leaps out and catches their attention, and their life is transformed. In fact, there's a whole organization, Gideon's Bibles, that go around placing Bibles everywhere they can because of the potency of that book. So at Ubiquity, we have been for many years now offering a course on the great books, and some of them are very ancient. Some of them are modern. Some of them are from the East, from the West. Some are novels. Some are scientific treatises. Some are biographies. Some are tomes of philosophy. Some are works of spirituality. And every year, Georgie and I and our guest lecturers choose works that we consider in some way to be seminal. And today, Kaylin Rain, who you all know, sent a link saying that George Orwell's 1984 is #1 in sales. I didn't know that when we picked it several months ago, and I wrote the syllabus on it. But there could not be a more timely, great work to consider right now than George Orwell's 1984. So it is with great delight that I want to share some reflections from a guilty bystander, as it were, about this enormously impactful work that is speaking to people all over the world right now. And it's become a bestseller. And it was published in 1949, just a year before George Orwell died. And along with Animal Farm, that you'll also remember from him, it was published in 1946. It brought this man to international fame. George Orwell was born in 1903 in India. His father was a member of the British Foreign Service. They left when he was a child. He went back to England. He was educated at Eton, one of the elite schools for the empire. He distinguished himself even when he was in high school as a very fluid and powerful writer. And after he graduated, he went back to Asia, to Burma, as part of the imperial force that administered the Burmese, then came back to England in the 20s and 1930s, and wrote a book on his experiences in Burma. Then a publisher sent him up to Yorkshire and Lancashire in the Midlands there in England to look at the poverty of the British as a result of the Industrial Revolution. And he wrote another work that was well received, but not enormously popular, about poverty in England. And then, if you remember your history, in 1936, the Spanish Civil War broke out as Franco, an authoritarian dictatorship, launched an assault on Spain from Morocco. And people of progressive, Ernest Hemingway, George Orwell, and others went to Spain to fight on the side of the democratic revolutionary forces. And he was wounded. And from a wound from which he did not fully recover. Then in the Second World War, he participated with the war effort, working for the BBC, World Service, writing for the BBC. He had the opportunity at that time to see the rise of totalitarianism, both in Germany and fascism in Germany, and the Bolsheviks and communism in the Soviet Union. And he was shocked at the terror that was orchestrated by these totalitarian regimes. And it was out of that experience, as the Second World War came to a close, that left 50 million people dead. 50 million people dead. And the Holocaust for 6 million Jews and an equal number of Slavs and progressives were gassed. And then at the end, the United States dropped those horrendous atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and in a millisecond vaporized entire cities. More people were killed in the first half of the 20th century than all of recorded history combined, by several orders of magnitude. George Orwell went through that mega death experience as a brilliant writer. And out of it, as I said, in 1946 came Animal Farm, a parody of Stalinism. And then in 1949, his masterwork, 1984, where he projected it into the human future. What totalitarian political structures might look like, and how a single human being, Winston Smith, navigated his way through the intricacies of the imperial system called Oceania, one of 3 imperial systems that by 1984 dominated our planet. Many things can be said about this. I only have 2 lectures. So I would like to tell the story of 1984, everyone, as a love story, as a tragic love story that certainly takes up one of the most fundamental human themes, the noblest of human themes. How do we love in a time of political duress? How do we express affection in a world where affection has become superficialized and commodified and commercialized? And that was the great noble theme that George Orwell took up in his final masterwork, which made him instantly famous worldwide. And the great tragedy for George Orwell is then he just died, having produced his great work, like a caterpillar producing the chrysalis. He died. So 1984, it's a world in which the party dominated every aspect of life. And I would like to briefly just describe the context within which Winston Smith lived and grew up, and then proceed to tell the story of the rise, betrayal, and fall of his valiant attempt to love. Oceania was dominated by 4 major ministries. There was the Ministry of Love, whose job it was to ensure a harsh regime of law and order with weekly sessions, hate sessions, which we'll describe in a moment. There was the Ministry of Peace, whose job it was to administer war. Oceania was in perpetual war with the 2 other competing imperial systems. And then there was the Ministry of Plenty that was there to ensure the perpetual poverty of most of the inhabitants of Oceania. And then there was the Ministry of Truth that was there to create propaganda to make sure that everybody was caught in this notion that war was peace, freedom was slavery, and ignorance was strength. War is peace. Freedom is slavery. Ignorance is strength. Now, I'm going to be speaking a lot more about this in my second lecture next month. But at the heart of totalitarianism is the reality of doublethink. We see it all over in our world today, and that's the first point that I want to make. When we think of 1984, we think of George Orwell talking about Stalinist Russia, and of course, we're not in a totalitarian system anymore, and so we distance ourselves from the great truths to which he addressed that work. But I would like to submit for your consideration today, which we can discuss during the latter part of the lecture, that 1984 is more true in 2021 than it was in 1949, and it was in 1984. Think for a moment about our world. We're not subsumed by a party. We're subsumed by a capitalist system that has reduced every single one of us to consumers and commodities. We're all, through our propaganda that we come across and are subjected to every day on the television, on the radio, and on social media. It's all about being consumers, while at the same time, through Facebook and Google and social media generally, we are also commodities. Think about that as a totalitarian system. We are encouraged every day, and I think the average American receives 17,000 messages a day through some kind of media. And it's all around consumption to be happy is the bottom line. And every time we make an act, every email we write, every text we send, every phone call we make, every station we turn to, we are being watched by Big Brother. And that information is being used by that system of analytics to feed back to us that which the analytics think we want to see, and to subtly shape our consumer practices, which allows us to be commodified in a way that brings greater profits to those huge companies that are selling us the products and shaping our attitudes and behavior. It's been said authoritatively that Facebook, Google know more about our personalities than our husbands and wives and closest of friends. Think that thought for a moment. That the capitalist system within which all of us live and breathe and have our being, that is shaping our behavior, inducing our attitudes, commercializing us, commodifying us 24/7, knows more about us than we know about ourselves. That our dearest loved ones know about ourselves. And we go around thinking that we are free. Freedom in this world, my friends, is slavery. War has become peace, and ignorance has become strength. And if you think about it, it's very different in terms of the instrumentalities and the condition sets that George Orwell spoke. But at its essence, it's totalitarianism, and it's reducing the world to a Philistine level that is ultimately tragic in its consequences. We'll be considering some of the implications of this. One of them that I said was doublethink. And the purpose of doublethink, according to Orwell, is very interesting. Doublethink, where you think you're free, but you're really not. You're being induced to being commercialized and commodified simultaneously, where you're holding opposites that are contradictory together, and you think that 2 + 2 = 4, but you're continually being told that 2 + 2 actually equal 5. You know that happiness isn't a new iPhone, but you're being told over and over again, yes, it is. And out of that cognitive dissonance, you're trained to double think. And the purpose of doublethink is to consciously induce unconsciousness. The purpose of doublethink is to consciously induce unconsciousness. And orthodoxy means not thinking, not needing to think. Orthodoxy is unconsciousness. I want to just pause there just for a moment, and I want to watch my time because I want to get to the love story, but I just want people to take in, we are in 1984. That's why it's number one. We've been reduced to the orthodoxy that commercialization, commodification is just the way it is. Massive surveillance of the most intimate details of our lives is just the way it is. I can't tell you how many millennials I talk to, my own children, and I bring this to their attention. They shrug because they don't think there's anything you can do about it. That's orthodoxy. That's an induced state of unconsciousness that allows whatever is happening around us to just happen, and we just go into this mindless state of perpetual commercial commodification, and it's the dream state in which we are the most pliable because we think there isn't anything that we can do about it. And I want to challenge that today. And I'll be getting into a much more detail about it next time. But I want to now focus on the seed in Winston Smith, 39 years old, smoking cigarettes, drinking gin in a quasi-alcoholic state and haze as he goes through the days, ulcers on his legs, upset stomach all the time, slightly nauseous. He's being watched and he knows he has to watch, and he is aware that there's face crime, that if you look the wrong way, you can be noted by the authorities. And he doesn't know quite what to do. He's just beside himself. And on April 4th, 1984, he decides to start writing a diary. And he's got to make sure that the omnipresent telescreens that are watching every move, even in his own house, you know, that they're starting to have televisions now that can watch out. They say it's because they want to do the Nielsen ratings, see how people are responding to the shows. That's already out there in our world and is coming to a neighborhood near you. May already be in your living room. He decides he's going to write a diary. And so I want to start with his diary, and I'd like to read the few words about it because it's so beautifully written, first of all. And he said something that I think is at the heart of what we all need to bear in mind, given the craziness of the world out there. As he was reflecting on what to write, he said to himself that it was not by making yourself heard, but by staying sane that you carried on the human heritage. When I read that, I was just arrested in my mind. that in a time such as ours, it's not some great act. It's simply staying sane. That is the achievement. And I was in conversation with Apila the other day, and I made this observation, and she said, well, you know, it's interesting that when she was a young woman, she was talking to a Navajo elder, and she asked him, you know, what is the equivalent of the Christian notion of being saved, or the Buddhist notion of being enlightened? What's that in the Native American indigenous tradition? And he said, that's a very good question. I don't know. So he went off and consulted with the other elders and wise people, and they consulted and went into a session, a deep session for 3 days to ponder this question. What's the indigenous equivalent to enlightenment and redemption? And they came out and they said, just be normal. Just be normal. And that's what Winston Smith understood. And following that intuition, he wrote, to the future or to the past, to a time when thought is free, when men are different from one another and do not live alone, to a time when truth exists and what is done cannot be undone. From the age of uniformity, from the age of solitude, from the age of Big Brother, from the age of doublethink, greetings. He realized that sooner or later, he was going to be caught and he was going to be executed for what he had just done. And then he had a profound thought that since he was already dead, the most important thing right now is to stay alive as long as possible before the inevitability of his arrest. And then, very interestingly, that night, he had a dream. And in the dream, he dreamed of his mother. She was sitting in some place deep down beneath him with his young sister in his arms. He did not remember his sister at all, except as a tiny, feeble baby, always silent with large, watchful eyes. Both of them were looking up at him. They were down in some subterranean place, the bottom of a well, a very deep grave. His mother is all of our mothers. It's Mother Earth. It's the mother. It's very interesting that at that moment when Winston Smith opened his book for a revolutionary act of just keeping a diary that night, who comes to him from the subterranean worlds but the mother holding his sister. That's the Pietà, the Virgin holding the Son, the Virgin holding the feminine. But he was visited in the dream world by the mother. And it filled him with a sense of nostalgia. And then he says something that I think is worth noting in terms of what happens to nobility, to the great virtues, the great vices, the great drama of what it means to be human when everybody is buying iPhones and everybody's looking for the next electronic trinkets to make us a little bit more comfortable, and we think that is happiness? He says, tragedy belonged to an ancient time, to a time when there was still privacy, there was still love, there was still friendship. And when the members of a family stood by one another without needing to know the reason. The memory of his mother tore at his heart because she had died loving him when he was too young and selfish to love her in return. And because somehow he did not remember how, she had sacrificed herself to the conception of loyalty that was private and unalterable. Such things, he saw, could not happen today. Today there was fear, hatred, and pain, but no dignity of emotion, no deep or complex sorrows. And that is worth us just bearing in mind. Look what happened with Trump. Look what's happening in our consumer culture. Everything is superficial. Everything comes and dissolves in a nanosecond, and we move on. And we go from mass starvation in Africa to the latest scandal in Hollywood, to what Trump is doing, to COVID rates in South Korea, and it's just the flow. There's no longer time for depth. And when there's no more time for depth, there's no more opportunity for tragedy, for agony, for ecstasy, for what it means to be truly human. That is being lost in a culture of commercialization and commodification and doublethink and orthodoxy in a materialistic world. And we have vague senses of what it would be like to go deep, but then we rush on to the next thing. And just when you're getting into a movie on television, here comes the commercial that takes you in another level of cognitive dissonance. And the more cognitive dissonance, the more easily you're controlled. And then his dream continued, and this is the exquisite part. All of a sudden, he began to realize he was in a golden country, and a girl with dark hair was coming towards him across the field. With what seemed a single movement, she tore off her clothes and flung them disdainfully aside. Her body was white and smooth, but it aroused no desire in him. Indeed, he barely looked at it. What overwhelmed him in that instant was admiration for the gesture with which she had thrown her clothes aside. With its grace and carelessness, it seemed to annihilate an entire culture, a whole system of thought, as though Big Brother and the party and the thought police could all be swept into nothingness by a single splendid movement of the arm. That too was a gesture belonging to the ancient time. And then Winston woke up. And the word in his lips was Shakespeare. No author in all the world has more completely captured tragedy and drama than Shakespeare. And in a world of crass materialism, flinging off the clothes of her arm, with her arm, in a disdainful, carefree, I don't care what the consequences are, I want to be naked in the world. Ignited in Winston, juxtaposed with the memories of his mother, the beginnings of life. And then he had to go to work. And at work, because everything was being watched, and he worked in the Ministry of Truth, his job was to falsify the past. As things began to change in the politics and people got executed, people that were heroes last week had to be vaporized. And part of his job, as people were killed or policy changes were enacted, was to go back into the past, into the newspapers and into the magazines, and change the past so it kept up with the present. And it was the control of language that enabled the party to control the mind. And then, of course, every week they had the 2-minute hate session, where the visage of Emmanuel Goldstein, who was this heretic and schemer and revolutionary that had challenged the party. He had once been part of the party, but then something had happened and the stories kind of always changed. But it was Goldstein that was the image of the enemy. And every week for 2 minutes, everyone would have to come out and watch him, and there would be the bleating of goats. They made him seem like a goat, and there would be a character, and they would scream and holler and hate and just vent as much hatred as they possibly could at this television screen of Goldstein. And then it would stop and everybody go back to work. Well, in one of these sessions, he noticed that there was a woman behind him that was looking at him out of the corner of her eye. A woman with dark black hair. And he became very nervous and thought, this woman must be part of the thought police, and she's trying to see whether I'm being as energetic in my hate session as I'm supposed to be. Then he saw her again in a hallway, and then in the cafeteria. And he began to build up a hatred for her and a suspicion that she was an agent of the thought police. And then one day, he was wandering around the city of London. He lived in the city of London, in the great proletarian district of London, the great unwashed, the 70–80% of the population that are just consumers, commodified, ignorant masses of people. And the party didn't bother with them much, but people that worked for the party had to make sure they didn't go into those areas. But Winston, because he had now been agitated, he was starting to write a diary. He'd had the dreams of his mother and the dark-haired woman. All of a sudden, the woman had appeared in his life. And he went into those neighborhoods in London. And he was walking around and going in and out of various shops, not sure if he was being followed or watched. And he came into an antique store. And there was an old man there in the antique store, and Winston started to look at various objects, and what caught his attention was a little glass, sort of what we would call a paperweight. And inside the clear glass he didn't know whether it was a rose or an anemone, when they put something in the middle of the glass weight, and it's all beautiful. And that caught his eye. And he bought it. And he knew it didn't mean anything, but he just was feeling sentimental. And the point that I want to make about this is how we wake up in our life. Remember, we're all in Plato's cave. We're all shackled looking at the back of the cave. And the masters of the universe are shining images onto the back of the cave. And we think the images are real. We think an iPhone is what you actually need, a new car, a television. We think that that's true. And it is only through accident, through a dream, through an injury, through some kind of mishap, that somehow there's a crack in the worlds of our psyche. And we begin to realize that's not true. And then our perception begins to change. And as our perception begins to change, what we notice in life begins to change. And Winston found himself starting with a diary, then a dream, then noting the woman with the black hair. And then he ends up in the proletarian district in London in an antique shop. He picks up this little glass paperweight, buys it, goes out, starts walking back to home. And who does he see coming down the street but the woman in the black hair? And he goes into a frenzy. He's certain that this woman is out to spy on him. And for a moment, he thinks about using the paperwork and beating her over the head and killing her. But he doesn't, because he's too emaciated. Remember, he's drinking gin all the time. He's smoking cigarettes, got ulcers in his stomach. He got ulcers on his legs. He's bent over. He's a finished man. And then the next week, he's walking down the hall at the Ministry of Truth. And this woman comes at him, and she has a sling on. She'd obviously injured herself. And when she was about 5 meters away, she begins to stumble, and she falls down with great pain right in front of him. And he instinctively goes to help her. And as he's helping her up, he realizes that she slipped a little piece of paper into one of his hands. Then she kind of dusted herself off and excuse me and went away. Well, he knows that he's being watched. He's got this piece of paper. He slips it in his pocket very surreptitiously and then goes back to his booth. But all of a sudden, he's very, very agitated. And then he goes to the bathroom. And he takes the piece of paper out as he's standing at the urinal and looks at it. And there are 3 words. I love you. And in that instant, Winston Smith became alive for the first time. You can go for 39 years and not be alive. You can go your whole life and not be alive. This is the act of grace. Grace is that mercy from life that in ways beyond our imaginations wake us up to who we really are. And with Winston Smith, it was, I love you. And it was so beautiful the way he wrote it, that I want to read you a little bit more about what it says. At the sight of the words, I love you, the desire to stay alive had welled up in him, and the taking of minor risks suddenly seemed stupid. Only 5 nights ago, he had contemplated smashing her skull with a cobblestone or the glass paperweight, but that was of no importance. He now thought of her naked, youthful body as he had seen it in his dream. He had imagined her a fool like all the rest of them, her head stuffed with lies and hatred, her belly full of ice. But a kind of fever seized him at the thought that he might lose her. The white, youthful body might slip away from him. And what he feared now more than anything else was that she would simply change her mind if he did not get in touch with her quickly. But he couldn't do it because he was being watched all the time. All of you have had first love. Remember what happened in your body, what happened in your emotions, your heart, your whole being when you just feel loved, you feel emotion, you feel that essential human contact. It turns you completely on. So then they had to conspire very surreptitiously how to meet. And finally, there was a gathering down in Trafalgar Square where there was some prisoners from Eurasia that were being paraded. And the throngs of people came down to, shout, throw tomatoes and whatever at these prisoners that were being paraded through the streets. And they found themselves in the throng. And it was the first time they were able to touch hands. And they couldn't look at each other. And in one of the most beautiful moments in the story, her hand felt for his and gave it a fleeting squeeze. It could not have been 10 seconds. But he had time to learn every detail of her hand. He explored the long fingers, the shapely nails, the work-hardened palm with its row of calluses, the smooth flesh under the wrist. And yet they couldn't look at each other because the screens would see that they'd had some essential contact. So what's beautiful is that, and this is writing at its most exquisite. While he was holding the hand of this woman whose name he did not even know, feeling her for the first time, he was looking at the eyes of one of the prisoners being held up to public ridicule. And then they made an arrangement to meet. And it's very poignant how they met. And I want to just go through it. And I know we're running out of time, but this is just so precious here. And then I'll close. But she basically says we should meet in the country. So they went to the country, and he got there by train, and he was walking out, and he found himself going down a lane and across a meadow, and the meadow was full of bluebells. Well, what do bluebells mean symbolically? Bluebells have traditionally expressed gratitude and humility. And they're used in England and Ireland to call out the fairies. And they symbolize eternal love and the purity of heart that makes love possible. So he finds himself walking over a field of bluebells. And he picks some because he wants to give them to this woman. So he wanders on and goes down, and he finds himself in the woods. He finds himself in the forest. And the sweetness of the air and the greenness of the leaves dawnted him. And then all of a sudden, he was in a natural clearing, and the girl was there. "Here we are," she said. "Look at the trees." And the trees were ash trees. Now, the ash tree, deeply magical trees used for all kinds of medicines. And they're the trees, according to the ancient Druids, that unite the past and the present and the future. And that's why the Druids referred to the ash tree as the tree of life. So here they are, finding each other through all the vicissitudes of circumstance. With a glance, with a note, "I love you," with a touch of the hands, then they find themselves in a meadow of bluebells, in a grove of ash trees. And then they come to a clearing. And they make love. And she finds out that, or he finds out that this is not the first time. She's done it scores of times, because for her, eros, pure sexuality, was her ultimate revolutionary act against the system. And then after they had slept for a while, they woke up, and he had discovered that her name was Julia. A thrush alighted on a bough not 5 meters away, almost at the level of their faces. Perhaps it had not seen them. It was in the sun. They were in the shade. It spread out its wings, fitted them carefully into place again, ducked its head for a moment as though making a sort of obeisance to the sun, and then began to pour forth a torrent of song. In the afternoon hush, the volume of sound was startling. Winston and Julia clung together, fascinated. The music went on and on, minute after minute, with astonishing variations, never once repeating itself, almost as though the bird were deliberately showing off its virtuosity. What made it sit at the edge of the lonely wood and pour its music into nothingness? Winston wondered. The thrush expresses the freedom of emotion, but there's one detail about the thrush that I want to note here, because I think it's important. What bird watchers observe about the thrush is that the quality of its bird song never varies. It's completely repetitive. That's how you can tell a thrush. But in this story, it engages in all kinds of variations. I could speak volumes about it, and we may get into it on another time or maybe the lecture next week. But when human beings open themselves up to freedom, that allows nature to also be free. I think it's important that as Winston and Julia broke out of the constraints of their world with the authenticity of love, the thrush also broke out of its world into a song of many variations. And that was the moment, the apogee moment of 1984, within which Winston and Julia found themselves, and true freedom and true authenticity began to emerge. I'll close now and open it up to discussion. But next time we will go into what happened subsequently and challenge both of them in ways they never originally imagined. So thank you, everyone. Those are my initial reflections on 1984 as a tragic love story. And now I'll turn it over to my distinguished colleague from Budapest, Dr. Georgi Szabo. And then all you students, start raising your hands, and then we'll go through the discussion for the next 30 minutes. Thank you, everyone. Georgi?
Oh, thank you, Jim, for another fascinating lecture. Wow, powerful, deeply powerful. Well, I must say that I was a little bit concerned about the topic, rather this book you have chosen as the first book to start of the year, but we just need to face ourselves, isn't it? And this is ourselves. What you said, what George Orwell wrote in that book, it applies so much for now. As you were talking, I was thinking about my own past, that I endured and experienced for 20 years in a communist regime, that how many times the history and the story of this country and globally was rewritten. And I was thinking, is it just really this kind of like century? No, humankind has been doing this for forever. Let's just go back just a few thousand years to Egypt. You go to Karnak or Luxor and you see all these big slabs of columns, and the cartouches are all kind of like, erased and deleted because one dynasty didn't want to really know about the one before. So then I was thinking that, gosh, how much are we evolving? Well, the expressions and the manifestation of ourselves clearly different, but something is still continuing, rather not, it's not the pattern, but there is the continuum, right? So it's a little bit depressive, I must say, really what humankind is producing. Then when you were saying that this story is a tragic love story, humankind has this tragic love story, but I think the biggest tragedy is that we feel so superior to anything and everything around us, the greatest separation from nature. So would the I love you be superseded by loving myself first, really? And
inevitable. Very powerful question to ponder. So thank you, Cindy. Reagan used war is peace in invoking détente. Absolutely. The United States has been in perpetual war for the last 75, 80 years now, since the Second World War, and we call it peacemaking. And then from Victoria, I've been asking myself the question how to love others who think so differently than I. If they oppose my values, should I disengage with them, or can I keep looking how to love, stay in love, no matter what? My God, in an age of fake news, in an age where we're almost in civil war in the United States because of the divide, living in completely different parallel universes, your question could not be more profound. My family, my immediate family, my sisters are ardent Trump supporters, for example. They're evangelical Christians. I'm not a Christian at all. They embrace Trump as sort of this messianic figure. And for me, Trump is a thug. How do you bridge that divide? Do you love by just simply not talking about it and talking about your birthday or, you know, what you had for Christmas dinner, and you just skirt around the differences? Do you go into the differences knowing that when you embrace orthodoxy, like the Trumpists do, the evangelical Christians do, you become incapable of true dialogue? How do you mediate differences? We saw with George Floyd here in the United States. We can't even bridge the differences between black and white very well. It's really an extraordinary challenge that we have for how we relate to diversity. On the one hand, we know that the more diversity, the more creativity, but we at the same time want everybody to look like us, believe like us, think like us, and act like us. And we tend to choose as partners people just like us. So that's a very, very important question, Victoria. Maybe one of the most important questions in the world today. It's really Paula Petrie, freedom is associated with capitalism. Now it's time to associate it with freedom of thought. Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. Tugchi Balik, I have a quick question. You mentioned that tragedy is being lost and we are losing the debt of tragedy as we are constantly flowing between multiple stories, COVID, war, etc. So tragedy is externally being lost in our world. You also mentioned your millennial kids are very jaded about this. Truth, and she's also a millennial here. Do you think this is just a way for us to also not feel tragic in such debt internally? We are afraid to face our authentic selves, so we bypass reality through capitalism and continue to buy into it. Absolutely. Absolutely. Our entire educational system, which we've created ubiquity as an antidote for, is to cultivate pliant citizens and happy consumers. So it's, again, like Plato's cave, the social structure, particularly in a totalitarian system, which is, you know, really overt, like in the Soviet Union or Germany, for example, and the subtleties of the totalitarian system of capitalism have the same effect of making our human individual lives shallow and satisfied by externalities, both in terms of behavior and in terms of attitude and thought. And so that's why Orwell was making the observation: true tragedy, true pathos is sacrificed with orthodoxy of any kind, because orthodoxy induces a certain unconsciousness where we go through patterns of behavior. Like in Plato's cave, we're just looking at the shadows at the back of the cave. And it takes some kind of external force to start the process of of waking us up. Well, we're just coming to a close here. This book is so timely. This is a race between our collective awakening and the totalitarian power made possible by technology and AI. Absolutely. We're in a race of tipping points, everyone. And we've got to wake up. And just in closing, the most powerful way to wake up is through those three simple words: I love you. It is love. Love of the mother. Love of each other. Love of nature. That begins to connect us with those deep verities that emanate out of the primordial essence of who we are. It is love that is the intermediating intelligence in the cosmos, in history, in our lives, that binds all of our contradictions together and begins to weave them into something beautiful. That's what Diotima, the crone in the Symposium of Dialogue, taught Socrates about the true nature of love. And George Orwell was playing with this very deep theme that in a time of COVID, there's nothing more important than loving one another. It's out of love that coherence comes. So I just want to embrace that, find somebody to love. Love with abandon. Be willing to take your clothes off as you run through the meadow of bluebells and embrace in the clearing, in the woods, wherever you are, somebody in an act of eros. That's the best vaccine I can think of in a time such as ours, is true love, true authenticity, which starts ultimately with reverencing of the mother. And that's nature, Mother Nature. So thank you, everyone. We will continue next month, same time, same station, and I'll be delving into we had the rise, and next month we'll have the fall of the love affair between Winston Smith and Julia. Bye, everyone. See you next time.
Hi, Jim, are you still there? Jim, are you there?